In the early 1900s, Western scholarship spared no effort separating Kemet, that is ancient Egypt, from the rest of the African continent further south. However, these efforts proved vain due to the immense amount of archaeological data uncovered in the region that has shown deep cultural affinities Kemet shares with Africans further south. These affinities were first denied and rejected by mainstream Egyptologists and Western scholars. But since in the field of science, facts and hard evidence can hardly be ignored, the field of Egyptology has since had to recognize at least the following, and I quote, "Archaeological data has suggested that the Egyptian religious system has close cultural affinities with Eastern African populations and arose from an African substratum rather than deriving from the Mesopotamian or Mediterranean regions." No comment. In the last video of this series, we saw how Kemet has strong cultural affinities with West African peoples. This was after we showed the genetic and linguistic link between Africans from all over the continent in part 1 of this series. And all this was supported by strong archaeological evidence. In this video, we look at the strong cultural affinities that Kemet has with East Africa. This is the third video in our series showing the link between Kemet and Inner Africa, a way to remind people of the Africanity of so-called ancient Egypt, which I like to call by its actual name, that is, Kemet. But wait, what's that I hear? You haven't seen the previous videos of the series. Oh, you're new here. Well, first of all, welcome to Debunking. Please feel free to subscribe if you like what we do here, and feel free to go over to my channel to check the first 2 parts of this series in order to understand the framework of our analysis, or just check the description below for the links to the first and second parts of this series. It's very important that you understand the framework of this analysis so that you can fully grasp the importance of the information that's about to be shared. So please, for those who haven't seen the first 2 parts, go watch them first before continuing this one. A lot of the concepts that will be used here have already been explained there. So go watch those videos first. We'll wait for you, I promise. Have you watched it? Then let's carry on. But before we do, I just learned that 75% of people who watch my videos are not subscribed. No wonder why I have more views than subscribers. Maybe that's because I don't often remind you to subscribe. So, come on, subscribe to the channel in order to support what we do. And if you really like what we do here and would like to further support the channel, I would like to inform you that we also have a Patreon account. That's right, join us on there for further support. Your pledges would deeply be appreciated. You can also send super thanks via YouTube. If you like, leave a like or comment to let the algorithm know that this content is worth boosting. Right, now let's roll the intro and get into the video. So, Kemet and East African peoples. What do they have in common? To the modern-day Egyptologist and mainstream media, the answer is simply, well, they have naught in common but the fact that they are both located on the African continent. These claims they make without confronting the large amount of evidence that points to the vast amount of other commonalities between Kemet and East Africans. That's without mentioning the obvious interactions between Kemites and their inner African brothers, and other fields of studies like genetics, linguistics, and archaeology that have clearly shown the common origin of East African peoples and their Nile Valley siblings. This evidence was presented in part 1 of this series, so go watch that part over to my channel or check the description box below for a link to that video. Anyhow, DNA evidence, for instance, shows the following. A study by Terreros et al. 2005 has stated the following. However, analysis of polymorphic alloinsertions, a family of short DNA sequences, have shown close affinities between specifically Eastern Sub-Saharan populations and Egypt, suggesting the influential role of the Nile Valley as a migratory route and agent of gene flow, contributing to present-day heterogeneity in Egypt. This clearly shows a link between the peoples of the Nile Valley and East Africans, though some of the modern people of the Nile Valley try to deny it, because they have too much of the non-African blood. But it's okay, they will soon come to realize their mistake. Is it crazy to think that the people who lived along the Nile River, or in its vicinity, could have been using it as a migratory route up and down the eastern half of the African continent? No, it isn't, and we have genetic evidence to support this, as well as archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence. Another study by A. Stevanovic et al. 2004 said this when they studied the DNA of the Upper Egyptian population of Gurna. Our results suggest that the Gurna population has conserved the trace of an ancestral genetic structure from an ancestral East African population, characterized by a high M1 haplogroup frequency. The current structure of the Egyptian population may be the result of further influence of neighboring populations on this ancestral population. An ancestral East African population that was later influenced by neighboring populations. One of these were the Central Saharans, who arrived in the Nile Valley after their East African brothers. This was mentioned in part 1. Another group that had an influence on this ancestral East African population are foreign peoples, such as the Eurasians in later periods of Kemet's history, who came and mixed in with the local black African populations from the Old Kingdom onwards, which was minimal at the beginning and later increased in later periods such as the Ptolemaic period, the late period of Kemet. This study clearly shows a common origin in East Africa of the Nile Valley peoples, not to mention the many anthropometric studies that have demonstrated the tropical Nilotic body plans of both the Kemites and the Kushites. And where are the Nilotic people located? In East Africa, as they always have, and this for as long as we can remember. These are people like the Maasai of Kenya, the Kalenjin, or the Dinka of Sudan. But it's not only genetics and anthropometrics that support this view. All these Nilotic peoples share the same geographical area with the people at the origin of the so-called Afro-Asiatic language family, the language family that the ancient Egyptian language just so happens to belong to. Linguistics also point to an East African origin to ancient Nile Valley languages such as Kemetic or Meroitic. Scholar Christopher Arrett has done extensive research and work on that, and he has shown the Africanity of Kemet linguistically. His research was supported by extensive archaeological evidence. Arrett and other linguists have reached the conclusion that the origin of the Afro-Asiatic language family was in and around the Horn of Africa, and their view has gained broad scholarly support. Why? Because East Africa, specifically the Horn, includes the geographic center of the present distribution of the Afro-Asiatic language family, and the majority of the diversity observed among the Afro-Asiatic languages is also found there, and this is considered a telltale sign for a linguistic geographic origin. So it is safe to say today that the origin of the so-called Afro-Asiatic language family is in Africa, and thus signifies that the ancestors of the Kemites were East Africans who simply migrated north and later mixed in with other populations, such as the Central Saharans and much later incoming Eurasians. But how does the Egyptologists deal with all this evidence, proving their unsupported claims wrong? They give it the silent treatment, of course, and prefer to go on TV and spread their unsupported claims from a position of authority. That way it is easy to fool the people. It's the expert after all, so the people say. Who are we to question his claims? He has a degree in the field after all. It's got to be true, says the layperson. But what the layperson forgets is that experts can sometimes be wrong. But who is to blame them for their position there? The layperson is simply not presented the debate properly and honestly. The mainstream propaganda machine feigns to ignore that there are many other experts who disagree with the position of the expert they brought in for the viewer to be enlightened on the subject. They feign to ignore that the claims of the expert they present have no substance and can easily be dismissed in a serious scholarly debate. But thankfully, today, we have the internet and social media to counter the BS. Our generation can get an alternative to the propaganda on TV and verify the validity of any statement from the comfort of our home. And that's why people like you and I are here, to let the future generations know of these hidden facts that are expressly hidden by the Egyptologists, mainstream scholarship, and the media. Our generation is here to reverse the brainwashing. Our generation is that generation. And as the brilliant YouTube channel Mr. Imhotep says, we are that generation. Hashtag that generation. Let's pick up the hashtag and reveal the hidden facts, reverse the brainwashing for a better world and a better future for all. So what are these hidden facts, you ask? Well, besides genetics, anthropometrics, and linguistics, anthropology, and specifically cultural anthropology, supports an East African origin to Nile Valley cultures as well. And the evidence to support this is extensive. And that's what our current video is about to present. We're going to present a deep cultural comparison that will leave no doubt as to the common origin and the deep and strong cultural affinities between Kemet and East Africans. But before we do that, we need to do a little recap on the definition of culture, because the definition of culture is the very framework we use for our cultural analysis. That way, if all the boxes of the definition are checked, they constitute as actual cultural affinities. So, what is culture? According to Edward Tyler, an English anthropologist, Culture is an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, art, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. Therefore, our presentation will be in the following manner. We will show the similarities point by point in social institutions, then social norms, beliefs, and customs, then in arts and crafts, and lastly, in capabilities. These 4 points will include the various items that were mentioned in the definition of culture. So we start with social institutions. And before we go on, guys, I would like to give a little disclaimer. Bear in mind that I cannot go into details and mention every East African civilization that has ever existed. None of us wants the video to be 100 hours long. So if I don't mention certain things that you may know about, feel free to share them in the comment section. We would really appreciate that, and preferably share them with a source for people to verify your claim. So with that said, let's begin. 1. Social institutions. First, let's remember what a social institution is. A social institution is a group or organization that has specific roles, norms, and expectations which functions to meet the social needs of society. The family, government, religion, education, and media are all examples of social institutions. But in this segment, we are only going to focus on government and religion, because those are the 2 areas on which we have the most information on for the ancient world. So we start with government. As we pointed out in the previous video, the government of Kemet and those of inner African societies share a lot of affinities. For one, the idea that the king is divine or sacred is also a concept that could be found in certain East African societies, just as we observed in West Africa in the previous video. The sacred or divine nature of the king seems to be a prominent cultural trait in traditional African societies. For instance, in Kemet, the Neswut, that is the pharaoh, for those who may not be in the know, was considered divine or sacred. He was appointed by the hand of God. He was the high priest of the faith itself, kind of like a pope. By the way, there is a great number of things the Catholic Church copied from African tradition. Did you know that? Anyhow, a topic for another video. So, just as in Kemet, in Kush, the Neswut was also a high priest and a divine sacred ruler. But we all know here that Kush and Kemet are part of the same civilization. Kind of like the Greco-Roman civilization, we also have in Africa the Kusho-Kemetic civilization, so I like to call it. My friend at Without History likes to call it the Nubio-Kemetic complex. I think this one works better. Let us know in the comment section which one you prefer. By the way, go check out Without History's YouTube channel. Great stuff is happening over there too. Anyhow, the Nubio-Kemetic civilization. The mainstream Egyptologists would deny this fact, even if the evidence is overwhelming. Kush and Kemet are sister civilizations, just like Greece and Rome. Anyhow, we also find in East Africa the same divine nature of the king. For instance, in the Buganda kingdom, the king known as the Kabaka was considered divine or sacred, and was also the head of the priesthood of the kingdom. This was the same for the Kikuyu of Kenya, who believed that, and I quote, "The leader of a human society is the one possessing the highest vital force, as at that time, or the one closest to God, or both. Since the leader of this human society has the highest vital force, and hence closer to God than any other person, he should be able to nourish the rest of the people by linking them to the ultimate God, and by being able to command lower forces to act in such a way so as to reinforce the other human's vital force." This is clearly the concept of divine kingship that we also find in Kemet and Kush. Yes, there too the Nesut were supposed to be the highest vital force and be closer to God than common man. This can be found in West Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. Same way to conceive kingship, truly African people. As for social hierarchy, it was much the same. They also put the king at the top, the priesthood, the warriors, and the officials second, then third came the artisans or skilled workers, then at the bottom we have the peasants. Just as Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop informed us in his book The African Origin of Civilization in the following passage. The social stratification of African life is precisely that of Egypt. In Egypt, the stratification was as follows: peasants, skilled workers, priests, warriors, and government officials, the king. In the rest of Black Africa, we have peasants, artisans or skilled workers, warriors, priests, the king. Yes, these were indeed from the same cultural mold. And we compared last time with Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia's social hierarchy was very different from that of the Africans. That is simply a fact. And also look at this image that just shows how much these people had the same way of conceptualizing things. This is King Oyo of Uganda sitting on his throne. Notice the lion head armrests that are the same as on the throne of Tutankhamen. And look at this other image supporting the hypothesis that the crowns of Kemet were inspired by African traditional hairstyles. Look at the way they shape at the back. It is crazy. This is simply the same thing. The crown was really inspired by these African peoples. This is a Kikuyu man, and this is another East African man, and this is also another Kikuyu man on a drawing. So really an East African origin of things in Kemet, of their society, of their people, of their culture, of their kingship. And yes, again, these people were really of the same origin. This is why I believe that the concept of kingship in Kemet came from this same southern nest. Think about it. In traditional Africa, the state and the religion were inseparable, and since the scholars have already acknowledged the fact that the religion of Kemet and Kush both came from East Africa and emerged from an earlier African substratum, so the same southern African nest, it therefore stands to reason that the concept of kingship found in Kemet and Kush also emerged from this same earlier African substratum, i.e. the same southern African nest. And with all these striking similarities in royal tradition in Kemet and Kush and continental Africa, the thesis seems very solid. And did you know that the Kemites took their pharaonic tradition from Kush? Yes, it has been demonstrated. It is only due to Egyptologists' reluctance to admit a Black African origin to any concept that is foundational to Kemet that this fact is not well known. I made a video on this topic too. Check out my video on the True History of Nubia, link in the description of course. Now let's move on to religion. And here folks, there is no debate. Remember the introductory quote, right? Archaeological data has suggested that the Egyptian religious system has close cultural affinities with Eastern African populations and arose from an African substratum rather than deriving from the Mesopotamian or Mediterranean regions. It speaks for itself, and so does the thumbnail of this video. The information you're about to be presented will leave no doubt in your mind as to the common origin of the Nile Valley people and their siblings further south in East Africa, or at the very least convince you of a connection between Black Africans and Kemites. But some might say,
so what? They share the same religious beliefs. It doesn't prove they were the same people.
It is not for nothing that the Egyptologists concluded that the religion of the Kemites came from East Africa and arose from an earlier African substratum. How do you think such knowledge got there? By magic? Clearly people moved with it, and we have genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence to prove it. What more do some people want? And as I explained in the previous video, if people have been separated for a long time, and yet they still have the same cultural practices, this means they were once part of the same culture, like the same people, the same group, the same society. That's what I mean. Because the behavior was so entrenched in the society that even after the separation of the people, centuries after, they still practice it. In different locations, still practice the very same thing. This, to the anthropologist, leaves no room for debate. The people were once of the same culture, of the same society. Anyhow, let us now present this information before I go on another tangent. So, let me first start off by showing you this beautiful image that I got from the brilliant YouTube channel Mr. Imhotep. Look at this image. Woman with ostrich feather on her head, Ulad Ahmed, Sudan. Goddess Ma'at with ostrich feather on her head, Kemet. Those who are in the know already understand the significance of this image, but I will elaborate for those who may not be. The ostrich feather in Kemet was a significant cultural item. First, the goddess, or better yet, the Neteru Ma'at, who was the Neteru of truth, justice, balance, law, morality, and order, all very important things for an organized society, is always represented with an ostrich feather on her head. This shows you already the importance this African animal has in this so-called Mediterranean culture of Eurasian origin. But what is more interesting is the fact that Ma'at weighs the hearts of men against the ostrich feather in order for them to enter the afterlife. This is how important this animal's feather was in this northeastern African society. And where did the Kemites get these ostrich feathers? In Mesopotamia perhaps, or Libya? No, they got them from Kush and Punt. So, Inner Africa. Now, was this symbolic use of the ostrich feather also present in Inner Africa? Well, yes, and very much so. For instance, in Taseti/Kush/Nubia, the ostrich feather was used in the exact same way as in Kemet. And the same goddess Ma'at was also worshipped there. And yes, she also wore the feather over there. Now, to the Egyptologist, it is clear that the quote-unquote Nubians copied the practice from the Egyptians. This they assert without providing any evidence once again. It is a mere assumption that the Kushite copied it from the Kemites. Serious scholars know that the practice was certainly present in Taseti/Kush prior to Kemet, and this for the following reasons. 1. The feather was first used there since the Kemites bought it from there. 2. The Kushites are older than the Kemites. Their civilization started earlier and the Kemites followed and are most likely descended from the Kushites. 3. In the Kemitic mythology, they state that their gods, coming from Punt, first pass by Taseti/Kush, then come to Kemet. And here is a quote from the Papyrus of Ani, the so-called Book of the Dead, to solidify my point here. The gods love the smell of him when he, the eldest born, cometh from Punt, when he traverseth the land of the Machayu, the beautiful face coming from the land of the god, i.e. southeastern Sudan. The gods cast themselves down at his feet when they recognize his majesty, their lord, the lord of fear, the mighty one of victory, the mighty of will, the lord of crowns, who maketh offerings to flourish, and createth the divine food. The land of the Machayu there is Nubia, and notice that they said that the Lord coming from Punt, that is Inner Africa, passes first by Nubia, then goes to Egypt. This is a metaphorical way to say that their religious ideas came from Inner Africa, then came to Kush, then went to Kemet. That is a metaphorical way of tracing the history of their religious ideas. So, straight from the horse's mouth, they got their religion from Inner Africa. And there is another passage on the same papyrus that claims the other gods also come from Punt. And this quote lets us know that before the ostrich feather was in use in Taseti, it was first in use in Punt, that is Ethiopia, Somalia, Southern Sudan, and most likely the Great Lakes region too. So Inner Africa. They didn't say the Lord cometh from Mesopotamia or the Delta region. They said Punt, Inner Africa. And this image proves this point even more, for the use of the feather on the head is widespread in East Africa. The Maasai, the Turkana, the Kisi, the Baganda, just to name a few, all present this very important cultural feature. Another very telling fact about East Africans and the people of the Nile Valley is that we find in Somalia the worship of certain deities from Kemet. In ancient Somalia, the proposed land of Punt, the people used to believe in a supreme being called Wak or Ebe, who was represented by lesser deities called the Ayanle. Does this structure ring a bell? Yeah, that's right. It is the same structure we saw in Kemet, but not only there. We also saw it in West Africa. So the so-called lesser deities or spirits of the ancient Somali religion are just like the Neteru of Kemet and Kush, or the Abosom of the Akan, or the Orisha of the Yoruba. And so in ancient Somalia, they are called the Ayanle. And some will say that East Africa and West Africa have nothing to do with one another. Delusional. The ancient Somali are also said to have worshipped the god Horus, of his true name Heru, whom the Somali themselves called Hur. Notice the very close linguistic affinity. The pronunciation is almost the same. And this god Hur was said to be a bird or to have the head of a bird. So just like Horus or Heru of Kemet and Kush. Again, we're not making this up for those detractors out there who like to say that we are stealing Egyptian history and making things up. With this evidence, I think the Neteru Heru was known in Africa before Kemet was formed. Another East African religion that follows the same, shall we say, traditional African religious structure is the Wakefana religion of the Oromo people of Ethiopia. The faith of Wakefana has a supreme being known as Wak. So just as in Somali, who is transcendent, mysterious, and at the origin of everything. So just like Amen or Amon of Kush and Kemet, or Olodumare of the Yoruba, or Nyame of the Akan, the Oromo have Wak, the supreme being, the hidden one, the mysterious one, the one at the origin of everything. Then the Oromo also worshipped the so-called lesser gods that are known as the Ayanna. These, as we learned in the previous part of this series, are manifestations of the supreme being, deified aspects of life and nature, and deified ancestors. So again, like the Neteru of Kush and Kemet, such as Isis and Seth, etc., or the Orisha of Yoruba land, like Shango or Eshu. So, more connections. And have you noticed this? The Oromo and the Somali are basically practicing the same religion. Even linguistically, you can see the similarities. You have Wak for the Somali, Wak for the Oromo, Ayanle for the Somali, Ayanna for the Oromo. Interesting. Another typical practice found among the people of East Africa is the ritual of libation. And as we saw in the previous part, libation is a very common practice in Africa that is still practiced today. Ancestral worship was also a characteristic feature of East African civilizations, just as in Kemet. The presence of a priestly class that wore leopard skin was also present in both Kemet, Kush, and East Africa. Just look at this image. Here is a Kemite priest, and here is an East African priest from the Sidama people of South Ethiopia. One thing thing that is funny is that this is how they like to stereotypically represent the African tribal man, right? With the leopard skin or panther skin over his body. These are the connections we've been speaking of that the Egyptologists just liked to ignore. Anyway, another belief that shows the common origin of Kemites and their East African brothers is the worship of cattle. The Dinka, the Banyaranda, the Mundari, the Maasai, the Kushites, and the Kemites all give a very prominent place to cattle in their mythology and life. This is the result of their common pastoralist Nilotic origins. Why am I linking the Kemites not with other societies in Asia that worship cattle, and I am connecting them to the African ones? Because the cattle in Kemet and the cattle in East Africa are one and the same, and I'm going to prove it shortly. Both the Dinka, the pre-dynastic Kemites, and the Banyaranda have a dance for those long-horned majestic cattle from East Africa. Just look at this set of images. They speak for themselves. This is a statue from the Nakata culture, pre-dynastic Kemet. This is a Dinka man doing the dance, and these are Rwandese ladies doing the dance today. Cultural continuity. Evidence is there. Can't deny it. See, the pre-dynastic Kemite statue even has the typical East African curves. Ladies, I'm sure you have noticed it as well, right? The fellows noticed it even before I mentioned it.
Yeah, boy.
This dance of cattle was still present in Kemet as late as the New Kingdom, and I can prove it. Check out these images.
Isn't this getting to be interesting?
Yes, the internet is full of these images, these connections. I'm loving it. The work is being done in the shadows there. People are posting and putting these connections out there. I had noticed it, but someone else had noticed it on the internet, and they did this image compilation. So, we're noticing. Anyway, look at the top image there. These women are dancing, their hands up, just like the Dinka women over there. And on the second image, this is another image from Kemet, they compare the women to Rwandese women. And lastly, they compare the pre-dynastic statue of Nakada culture to the Rwandese women again. So the first image at the top there is from a tomb at Saqqara, and the second image can be found in the tomb of Keruef at Luxor. So, pre-dynastic, New Kingdom, they're all doing the same dance. Cultural continuity, and this dance can still be found in East Africa. The Dinka, the Banyaranda are still doing this dance. So you see, we have even shown you hard archaeological evidence of the early Kemites and later ones practicing something their East African brothers still do. Come on. Is this not significant evidence that these were the same people? And one thing I mentioned before is that the cattle breeds that the Kemites had, i.e. the long-horned cattle, also known as the Sanga cattle, originated in East Africa. This information comes to shatter one of the core arguments of the Eurocentric scholars who argued that Africans were introduced to cattle herding by Eurasians. But thanks to rigorous scientific studies today, this argument can no longer stand. And here is why. For a long time now, the story went as follows. Some Eurasians, probably from the Levant, came into Africa with cattle around 8,000 years ago. They first introduced them to Northeast Africa, but they even went as far as the central region of the Green Sahara. That is, according to Eurocentric scholars. Do they or did they have any archaeological evidence to support this view? No, it was merely speculation, up until scientific evidence came to shatter it. But still they kept pushing this fairy tale anyway. And so from this, they further extrapolated that those Eurasians who brought cattle to Africa were responsible for the civilizations in the Nile Valley as well. And all this was simply based on the assumption, emphasis on assumption, that cattle was introduced to Africa by Levantine types or some other Eurasians. But this is simply speaking a mere fiction. And here is why. As we saw, the most common breed of cattle in Kemet and Kush was the Sanga type, a type of cattle that can only be found in Africa and is indigenous to Inner Africa, specifically East Africa, according to recent studies, that is. Now, some scholars argued that this breed is the result of the independent domestication of aurochs from the Near East that mixed with the Indian cattle and then was later brought to Africa so that the Africans can finally be introduced to cattle herding. All this again based on mere assumption. It's mere extrapolation. These scholars, by the way, argued that the Indian cattle and the Near Eastern cattle were independently domesticated by both these people. So the Indians independently domesticated their cattle, the Near Eastern independently domesticated their cattle. However, when it comes to Africa, they somehow refuse an independent domestication of cattle and say that it must be the Near Easterners that brought it over there. However, an analysis of the mitochondrial DNA of the African breed of cattle shows a divergence from both the Indian cattle and the Near Eastern African one. So this DNA evidence came to shatter their view. And what's more is that the Eurasian scholars argued that the longhorn Sanga cattle type was introduced to Africa via Kemet in 1600 BC. However, archaeological evidence does not support that this specific type of longhorn Sanga cattle was introduced to Kemet in 1600 BC. Why? Because we already saw that the Kemites in the pre-dynastic period, Nakada culture, that is circa 3500 BC, so at least 2000 years before that, were already using the longhorned cattle. And this is proved by the evidence of the woman's figurine that was making the dance of the cattle. The dance that was clearly inspired by the Sanga cattle, the longhorned African cattle. A dance that can still, by the way, be found in various East African peoples who also use this cattle, like the Banyarwanda or the Dinka. Now, if you don't consider that figurine as a form of evidence, you may at least consider the fact that the goddess Hathor of the Old Kingdom had the head of the longhorned Sanga cattle type. Yes, and Hathor is an Old Kingdom goddess. That's at least 1000 years before their proposed date over there. So the scholars here have no claim to support this. It's again mere speculation, a fiction. And the fact that they used the longhorned cattle instead of the short-horned cattle from the Near East shows the reverence they had for their own type of cattle, the East African one, that literally saved their lives in the past. But this is not all. Archaeologists found evidence for cattle domestication much earlier in East Africa. This study by Fiona Marshall and Lyre Wisbrod, 2011, provides genetic and archaeological evidence for the independent domestication of cattle in Africa, which they believe originated in East Africa and propagated northward to Kush and Kemet. Here is what the article concluded. Taken together with data variation in autosomal microsatellites and other data on Y chromosome variability in African cattle breeds, the genetic data as a whole points strongly to an independent African domestication of cattle.
Nice.
Now, on the archaeological side of things, a scientific team found in Sudan the earliest evidence of cattle domestication yet. That's right, this article by Science Poland tells it all. Here is what they said in the article. Scientists have found that humans domesticated cattle around 10,000 years ago in the central Nile region in today's Sudan.
Say what?
In the central Nile region in today's Sudan. So the arguments of the scholars there stating that the Nile Valley people got their knowledge of cattle herding from Eurasians is simply false and is shattered by this kind of evidence. Hard scientific evidence, not speculations, not assumptions. And what's more is that the idea that the longhorn Sanga cattle was introduced in 1600 BC is shattered by this kind of evidence, because we find domesticated cattle in the Nile Valley 10,000 years ago. So why would they go take cattle from Eurasia when they have cattle in the central Nile region? So it is done. DNA evidence and archaeological evidence are clear on this. Cattle was independently domesticated in Africa, in East Africa. And so the view that the Kemites share a common origin with their East African siblings is no longer so far-fetched, is it? And as I stated in the first part of this series, the earliest ancestors of the Kemites and Kushites came from East Africa, around the Horn and the Great Lakes. This is what archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence all point to. Some of those early East African ancestors brought their cattle with them in their migration northward, and thus was cattle brought to Northeast Africa. It wasn't from Eurasia. And now that we have found the earliest evidence of cattle herding in Africa, couldn't we posit it was Africans who actually brought cattle to the Near East? And then to India? You see? But for that, we will have to have archaeological evidence to prove this. So until then, I'll say that you independently invented your cattle. But this is not the favor Africa has always had from mainstream scholarship, is it? It's always that they consider that Africans must have gotten it from Eurasians, of course, because it's been so since 400 years ago. This is what colonization has done to the field of studies. Colonization came with this idea that Africans needed Eurasian intervention to develop anything. That's what colonization came up with. But this is hardly science. In the scientific field, we need evidence to posit certain things. So Africans did not get the idea of cattle domestication from Eurasia, they did it independently. As it has been proven in India that people can independently come up with cattle herding. In many places, it's a human trait to wanna conquer nature, and so they start domesticating things around them, plants and animals, for a constant supply of food. The Africans are no different. I'm even sad that I have to say it, but this is what racism has done to the field of academia. Anyway, so it wasn't from Eurasia that the Africans got cattle domestication, it was from themselves, independently. And if you still deny this evidence, you are denying science. Bravo. Clap for him, folks. He's denying science. What a great guy. Or a science denier who can't face facts. This is hard scientific evidence, as is needed to hold a rational and truthful view of history. Anyhow, other beliefs the East African people share with the people of the Nile Valley are the belief in afterlife, the belief that our dead ancestors can have an effect on the life of the living, the belief in vitalism, and many other beliefs that I cannot list over here, because there is much and more to go over. Thus, we move on to the next point, that is 2. Social beliefs, customs, and norms. We start with social beliefs. Let's remember the definition real quick. Social beliefs are defined as enduring beliefs shared by society members with contents that are perceived by society members as characterizing their society. Nile Valley people and East Africans share a number of characteristic beliefs. For instance, they both believed in a similar afterlife. They both believed their ancestors who went to the afterlife could still interact with the living world. An afterlife where one enters and lives well with the ancestors had they lived a quote-unquote good life. They both believed the king was sacred or divine. They believed that the longhorn Sangre cattle was sacred as well, very characteristic of the region. They both believed in worshipping the ancestors. They both believed in the equality of the sexes and the importance of keeping the royal descent matrilineal. This was the case in most West African kingdoms as well. They passed the throne through the female line. Would you like to know the reason why they did this? Here is a quote from the book Pre-Colonial Black Africa by Dr. Kemet and Diop to enlighten you on the reason why they did this. This is an Arab observer telling us the reason why the West Africans had the matrilineal system. Among these people, custom and rules demand that the successor to the king be his sister's son, for, they say, the sovereign can be sure that his nephew is indeed his sister's son, but nothing can assure him that the son he considers his own, in actuality, is. Africans are funny. Guys, you have to admit it, Africans are funny. But hey, you can't blame a guy. He got trust issues. So he takes the safest bet. But on a more serious note, to the ancient Africans, royal blood and the royal line was so sacred or divine and so important to the well-being of the kingdom that they could not risk lose it by some mishap and bring down the wrath of the ancestors and the gods, and thus bring misery to the realm. So they took the safer route, where they could be 100% sure that the royal blood was still there, and that is in the king's sister's son, because, you know, the son coming out of the belly of a woman is her son. There can be no doubt about that. But a man cannot be 100% sure. He can be 99% sure only because, you know, mishaps.
You are not the father.
The Kemites actually took it even a step further, whereby they actually practiced incest. That is, marrying brothers and sisters. Like from the same mother and father.
Oh, hell no!
So that even if the sister goes on the side, you know, maybe with a guard, we are still 100% sure that the royal blood is still there. The aforementioned reason is the cause of this practice.
That was legitness.
Yeah, it was.
The East Africans and the Nile Valley people both believed in totemism as well. This is something we explored in the previous video. This is another of the many aspects of Kemet's culture that really puts it at odds with the Mediterranean cultures or other Eurasian/Near Eastern cultures. For you see, scholars tried to first deny the existence of totemism in Kemet, yet at the same time, they were trying to find it in North Africa and the so-called Near East. But their efforts were vain. As George Fraser and Kemet and Diop inform us, totemism cannot be found in Caucasian populations, but it was very present in Kemet and Kush and the rest of Africa further south. Now let's move on to customs. What are customs? Customs are a traditional and widely accepted way of behaving or doing something that is specific to a particular society, place, or time. Here, a very telling custom that the Nile Valley people share with their East African brothers is the practice of circumcision and excision. Yes, that is right. East Africans also circumcise both girls and boys. For instance, the Maasai people circumcise both girls and boys as a rite of passage. It is said that they got this custom from Cushitic-speaking peoples such as the Oromo of Ethiopia. Let's remember that the Cushitic people are part of the Afro-Asiatic language family, of which the ancient Kemetic language belongs to. And as Kemet and Diop informs us in his book The African Origin of Civilization, circumcision can only be explained in African cosmogonies. Here is the quote. Only among blacks does circumcision find an interpretation integrated in a general explanation of the universe. In other words, a cosmogony. Specifically, the Dogon cosmogony that Marcel Griol reports. In Dieudo, he reminds us that, to make sense, circumcision must be accompanied by excision. These two operations remove something female from the male and something male from the female. To the archaic mentality, such an operation is intended to fortify the dominant character of a single sex in a given human being. Edifying. In the previous part, we provided quotes from ancient sources that attest to the presence of male and female circumcision in Kemet. So go check out part 2 of this series for those quotes. Another custom the Kemites shared with East Africans and in general Inner Africa is the practice of the bride price. That is, before a man marries a woman, he has to give the family of the bride a sum of money and gifts. This is what some call Mari in East Africa or Lobola in Southern Africa. The Kemites also used to do the exact same thing, where a man who wants to marry a woman would go give the family of the woman some gifts and monies to marry their daughter. However, there are those who will say that the bride price was also practiced in Mesopotamia and Greece. But what those people don't tell you is that what was more common in those two societies was the custom of the dowry. That is, the money, goods, and estate a woman brings to her husband. So the woman would bring money, the family of the woman would bring money and goods to give to the husband's family in order for their daughter to marry the man. This custom is absent in Kush, Kemet, and the rest of Africa further south. We don't have the dowry system. It's non-existent in Africa, and it was non-existent in Kemet. Another aspect that shows the Africanity of Kemet and Kush. This highlights again the striking difference in cultural practices between Kemet and the Mediterranean and the Near East, as opposed to the striking similarities between Kemet and Inner Africa. The Kemites were indeed typical black Africans. Now, onto the norms. Norms. Social norms are shared standards of acceptable behavior by groups. Here again, we are solely going to focus on gender, i.e., how male and female were treated in society and what standards they held in society. So as stated in the previous part, really guys, go check part 2. So as stated in part 2, men and women in Kemet and Kush were treated quite equally. This was proven in a study done in 2017 by Radwa Khalil et al., where they said the following. Unlike other ancient societies, women in ancient Egypt had a high degree of equal opportunity and freedom. Ancient Egyptians, women and men, were firmly equal. Interestingly, ancient sources indicate that women were qualified to sue and obtained contracts incorporating any lawful settlements, such as marriage, separation, property, and jobs. Some of these rights are not given to women in modern-day Egypt. We are not making these sources up. Go check the description below for a link to the study. Women in Kemet could work, do everything a man could do. She was free to choose whether she wanted to work or stay at home. There was nothing enforced on her to say, no, you're a woman, you don't need to work because you have to make babies. That's not African. Now, in traditional East Africa, the same is quite true. Women have a fair and equal treatment to men. They equally participated in labor and contributed equally to their societies. We have instances where women were even queens to their kingdoms, such as the great Queen Gudit of the Aksumite Empire. We see in East Africa societies that trace their lineage to female ancestors. This means that they revere the female ancestor, the matrilineal line. This is the case of the Kikuyu people of Kenya, also called the Agikuyu. The Kikuyu of Kenya believe that their clans originated from the 9 daughters of the first ever couple, who are Gikuyu the father and Mumbi the mother. Daughters, not sons. Anyhow, so they named their society, their people, after the father, but revere the mother and her daughters as the original ancestors. So again, we see this balance of equality of man and woman even in their legends. Most African people, whether they are in East Africa or West Africa or in the Nile Valley, believed that the creator, that is the supreme being, created a man and a woman at the same time in order to get humanity, in order to procreate for humanity, not a man before a woman or the reverse. These first couples were in Kemet and Kush, Osiris and Isis, or Asar and Aset. In West Africa, the Dahomey had Lisa and Mawu. And in East Africa, the Gikuyu have Gikuyu and Mumbi. Yep. And why is this? Because they came from the same tropical African cultural mold, and also because, as the shrewd African wise men and women had observed, in nature, that is, biologically, you always need a male and a female in order to procreate. You can't do one without the other. So again, traditional Africa never needed a movement such as feminism, because they believed in the balance and the necessity of both sexes, and this in every aspect of life. On to the next point. 3. Arts and crafts. And here, folks, the imagery and evidence is there to show that these people were indeed of the same origin. But first, let's define these terms. What is art? Art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in visual form, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. And a craft is an activity involving skill in making things by hand. As I pointed out in part 2 of this series, art doesn't really vary from culture to culture, right? Meaning most cultures dance, sing, sculpt, paint, but the way they do it is where we can see the differences between cultures. So what we have noticed is the striking similarities in Kemet's way of making art and that of their inner African siblings. We have just noticed that the Kemites and the East Africans do the same cattle dance, as you can see on this image. Also, the statues and paintings of Kemet present a lot of features and phenotypes the same to that of their inner African siblings. Just see the following selection of images. Look at this image. This is a Beja man from southern Egypt. No one would call this man a Caucasian. This is why there was even a case where a man from Egypt with an afro who had a light skin like any mixed person went to the United States and refused to be labeled as Caucasian just because he was from Egypt. Because in the United States, when you go there, they ask you, what race are you? And you have to check black, whatever, Asian, whatever. I don't know about that. That's what I've heard that people do. So that man was like, I'm black. They said, no, you're from Egypt, you're Caucasian. He said, no, I'm black. I'm from Egypt and I'm black. And he sued the state in order for them not to label him as Caucasian in their charts.
That was legitness. Yeah, it was. Huh?
He said, I'm black. I'm from Egypt and I'm black.
Now, let's define black.
Bruh. Now look at this Beja man of northeastern Africa. Can you call this man white Caucasian man, or at least Caucasian man? No, no one would ever call this man Caucasian. No one. And so is the case for most Beja people you can think of. Look at the similarities of this black Beja man from Egypt and the hairstyle here. They say no, these are wigs. It's clearly not a wig because the hairstyle can still be found in southern Egypt. And the skin tone and the facial features, Anyway, and this picture again of the crown of Kemet being inspired by African hairstyles. And then we have another picture that is very telling that I like to use to show you that the Kemites were typical black Africans. The picture of Amenhotep III next to that of an Afar man. Again, not a wig that Amenhotep is rocking there. It's his hairstyle. We compare another set of images comparing Kemites' artistic representations with the Beja people. This is a dentist from Kemet. His name is Hesi Ra. He's rocking a typical afro.
Oh, it's just a wig.
Bruh. It's not a wig. Clearly it's not a wig because this hairstyle can be done by black people. They say it's a wig because they think the Kemites were Caucasian, so they know their hair can't do this. Anyway, this is Hesi Ra compared to the Afar men, but this is a hairstyle that can be found all over Africa. We do the afro all over Africa. To prove to you that these are not wigs, I wanted to compare these two images. This is a Afar man of Ethiopia, and compare the way the hair is standing there when they're doing the Kemites hair. And look at the skin coloration again. It's typical brown skin of the African people, right? So you see the way the hair is standing? They say it's not 4C the Kemites had, but how does the silk hair of the Eurasian stand like this? Like so high up, like this Ethiopian men's hair. So clearly it's their hair that they're styling. So more similarities between East Africans and Kemites and Nile Valley people. Now another imagery. This is from the brilliant channel Mr. Imhotep, who compiled these images. Brilliant. I love the way he styles his images to compare. So beautiful, so clear. Always has clear imagery. African women today, and Lady Keredwank of 2800 BC, the mother of Imhotep, the great genius. You see the similarities in hair? They will say this is not a hairstyle the Kemites used to rock wigs, but the hairstyle can be found in Africa. So the Kemites used to rock African wigs. These Caucasian, so-called Near Eastern, Mediterranean, Eurasian people were like, we don't like our hair, so we're gonna put African hair on our head. Come on. Anyway, another imagery from Mr. Imhotep again, comparing Lady Keredwank to a Sudanese woman. Again, same people, same, very same. Then again, the Beja men compared to other Kemite statues. The hairstyle is still present in Africa. And then again, the Afar people with their afros being so cool there, rocking the afro. Kemite statue rocking the afro with the same skin coloration, by the way, on the statue. Oh, it's just the color of the wood. It's not. Look closer, it's not the color of the wood. It's actual paint. Another image of a Beja man. Or is this an Afar man? I don't know. You see, you can't even tell the difference because these are the same people. A Beja man is from southern Egypt and an Afar man is from Ethiopia. And you can't tell the difference because they're both black. You can't see this man in America or today in Africa and think, oh, there is your typical Caucasian. No, you can't. Because he has all the phenotypes that would lead people to categorize him as black. Anyway, so you compare with the Kemite painting here, the hairstyle is the same. And then we have the very telling image of the Amatsunzu hairstyle compared to the crown, the blue crown of Kemet. This is a hairstyle that can be found in East Africa, specifically in Rwanda. Yes, and this is a crown of Kemet. More similarities. The crowns were inspired by the hairstyles of African people. So that's strike two. We saw the crown that lies down, I forgot the name, and the crown that goes up like this, both inspired by African hairstyles. Then again, this imagery of the Kemites doing their hair, people waiting so that they do their hair too. So clearly it's really not wigs that they're wearing. We have imagery showing that they're doing their hair standing there like an afro, like typical 4C hair. Anyway, then we have this imagery that I compiled. Beautiful. Good job, dahcadencemaker there. Anyway, you see the way the skin tones are the same basically between this woman of the Tomb of Mena and these Ethiopian beautiful women here and girl, cute girl there. And the hair texture, the hair is the same too, except for these two here, these two beautiful ladies here. They have afros, typical 4C hair, but these, you have the type 3A, whatever. And you see the ornaments on the head, very much the same. And then we have again the dance of the Dinka people compared to that of the Kemites doing the same cattle dance. And in terms of looks, East Africans and Nile Valley people also look the same. Like most typical tropical Africans, they have tightly curled hair, also known as kinky hair. And they also have high amounts of melanin, which makes their skin very dark in hue, that we today call black. Just look at this image from Mr. Imhotep's channel again. Shout out to Mr. Imhotep. If you don't already follow Mr. Imhotep, follow him. This image really shows you the resemblance of the Kemites and their East African brothers, right? Straight noses are also an African feature, and all these men are East Africans. And now, shall we talk about the neck collars and armbands and bracelets that both the Nile Valley Africans and East Africans similarly wear? That's right, see the neck collar there? This is a Kalenjin woman and the dancers from Kemet. Same things. And you see the armbands? They're always rocking armbands. It's a typical African style of jewelry and clothing. So again, crafts, they crafted the same things. Again, another Kalenjin woman rocking the armbands and the neck collar. And look at the similarity in complexion. And then another image, a Kalenjin man from Kenya wearing the same neck collar that the Kemites used to wear. And he is bare-chested, as any tropical African would be. Oh, and these images were given to me by the subscriber Mansa Musa. Thank you, Mansa Musa, for these wonderful images. And then we have this image, animal fat, clay perfume, and red ochre. The practice is still found in East Africa, and it was practiced in Kemet, so white clay and red ochre. And then we have the evidence of the African pillow. Great connection between the Nile Valley, West Africa and East Africa, because the Yoruba have the same headrests that the Kemites used in the past, thousands of years ago, and that the East Africans continue to use today. And as we saw in the previous part of the series with the Kemites playing an instrument, a musical instrument that can be found today in West Africa, that is the Molo lute, it is also the case that East Africans play a musical instrument that their siblings in Kemet used to play thousands of years ago. And this is the Krar harp. As you can see, these people really share the same culture and origins, but the mainstream media and scholarship keeps on denying these cultural affinities. It's just shameful at this point. Anyhow, this is all I got on the arts and crafts. I am sure many of you guys know of many more similarities, so feel free to share them in the comment section. Right now, we need to move on to the next point of this video, that is 4. Capabilities. Capabilities are activities, information, knowledge, procedures, processes, skills, systems, technologies, or unique adaptive features. For unique adaptive features, we have the fact that both the Nile Valley people and the East Africans, being natives of a tropical environment, chose to wear less and expose their dark skin more. As we have just shown you, most of them expose their torsos and only wear a skirt. As for knowledge, procedures, and skills, we just have to quickly glance at East African history to see that they were as capable as any human being on Earth to produce high civilization. Yeah, I know, it is sad I have to say it, but hey, racist scholars left their mark on the world. And now most people find it outlandish that black people can be capable of great sophistication just as any other human groups. But the saddest thing to me is when an Afro-descendant believes it too. That just breaks my heart. And so I am here to try to remedy to it. So, when we look at the lifestyle of pre-dynastic Kemites, we find that it fits perfectly with the lifestyle of many traditional East African groups and also generally with inner African groups. For instance, they both have the same traditional African building procedure for civilian dwellings, that is, round-shaped earthen huts with a thatch. Just look at this rendition based on archaeological discoveries on pre-dynastic cultures that this game made of a pre-dynastic Egyptian village. Yeah, your typical African village, so-called mud huts with a thatch. And both the pre-dynastic Kemites and the East Africans use Afro combs to style their hair. Yeah, this is true. Just check the normal palette for instance. The vassals of the first Nesut Pejet, that is the first pharaoh, holding the two serpopards, are both styling nice afros. They look just like your typical Afar men of Ethiopia, wearing an afro. So yeah, same procedures and knowledge. And just check the comparison between these combs of pre-dynastic Kemites and combs of Africans today to comb their afro hair. Now, as for the architecture of these regions, we find in East Africa obelisks that resemble very much those of Kemet. These obelisks are are found in Ethiopia today and were from the kingdom of Aksum. So the tradition of building obelisks for their ancestors, for the kings that have died, was still present in East Africa long after Kemet had fallen. And what's funny is that obelisks that are found outside of Africa were taken in Africa, that is in Egypt, or were copied from the African Kemetic style of construction. We also find in Aksum stone architecture that, according to Eurocentric people, were impossible to find in so-called sub-Saharan African societies. Ethiopia is full of temples and churches and castles that completely destroy such ideas. But the racist with his dull mind still comes after all these discoveries in Ethiopian archaeology with great stone structures and all, still comes today to leave comments like that under a video presenting scientific evidence.
Kwenemika, so you're Ethiopian. Nice try, you did. By claiming you guys have not enough food and saying that you skinny Ethiopians built pyramids. Egyptians' history belongs to Egypt, and Egyptians are diverse, not black, not white. It is simple.
Ah, the racist and his ignorance. Is it even ignorance at this point, or sheer wickedness? The Ethiopians are too skinny to build. Go! Such people are the scum of humanity. I obviously banned him from the channel. I can't have such nonsense on my channel. Anyhow, any intelligent person knows that people from Ethiopia are very capable of building great civilizations such as that of Kemet or Kush. Ethiopians invented their own writing system called Ge'ez, and still on architecture, the Baganda buried their royals in pyramid-like tombs. And did you know that the Kemites did a lot of trade with the land of Punt, that is modern-day Somalia, as the scholars surmise? They have found ruins there that attest to an ancient civilization that was there in the Somaliland. These are the Wargado walls of ancient Somalia. And lastly, another aspect that's worth mentioning is mathematics. We all know that Kemet and Kush were highly skilled mathematicians, right? This was known all over the ancient world and even now. Well, this deep knowledge in mathematics on their part may be due to the migrations from people of the Great Lakes region, that is East Africa. Why the Great Lakes region? Because it is simply the place where we find a few thousand years before the migrations towards the Nile Valley, the oldest complex mathematical operations known to humanity. This is in the Ishango artifact found in the eastern part of Congo, where after analysis, scholars were able to discover that the 25,000-year-old artifact was capable of performing all the 4 basic operations in math, that is, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. The artifact also displays prime number knowledge between 1 and 20, and for the nerds out there, they already know the significance of prime numbers in mathematics. This tradition of mathematics must have come from the Great Lakes through the Horn of Africa, then finally to Tasseti and Kemet. Such a long tradition of mathematics may explain why the Nile Valley people were just so great in math. And let us also remember that one of the sources of the Nile River is found in the Great Lakes region, that is in Lake Victoria. And since we know that the Nile River served as a migratory route up and down East Africa, it just makes sense to think that the people from the Great Lakes went north with this knowledge. Anyhow, this aspect aside, we have seen through a cultural comparison, coupled with genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence that East Africans and Nile Valley people are indeed of the same East African origin. Kemet is indeed a child of Africa, meaning its culture and its original people emerged on the African soil from the Black African cultural mold, and this makes Kemet a Black African civilization regardless of the minority Asian element that was present. I have said it before and I will say it again. All the evidence points to the fact that Kemet was a majority Black African civilization and was originated by those same Black Africans who came from Inner Africa. So, in the next part of this series, we are going to explore the cultural affinities of Kemet with Central and Southern Africa. There is very exciting information there as well. So if you don't want to miss that, please press the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. Oh, and also, please leave a like and a comment in order to help the channel be boosted by the algorithm. That way our message can reach more people. Finally, I would like to thank the Patreon supporters of the channel. Thanks a bunch for your monthly donations, they are very much appreciated. If you would like to join the Patreon family, there is a link in the description box of this video. Your further support would really be appreciated. Right, so that's it for this video. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. I know I did enjoy learning all this information. So if you enjoyed it, feel free to share it around with your family and friends and co-workers so that we can reach more people with this information and knowledge. We are that generation. So let's spread the truth and reverse the brainwashing. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.